All right. So again, some green arrows highlighting the things that are a little different than they were in the LODIC checklist, and we will run through them individually. So number 16, accumulation of chemicals affecting plant productivity and composition is not apparent. So again, this is similar to the water quality one, but it's about stuff kind of coming into the system, that not necessarily as part of the water cycle, but overflow or overland flow coming in with excess nutrients, fertilizer, things like that, causing eutrophication or changes that way. Pollution, oil coming in, antifreeze, things like that. So in this case, we've got a site that looks fairly healthy. The water looks like it should, so that would be a yes. In this case, we've got who knows what actually going on. We've got an unidentified tank. We've got some sort of black sludge. That's actually probably an algal mat that was hanging out in there for a little while. Some garbage on the backside, another 50-gallon drum, some industrial stuff in the background. But the entire integrity of the wetland site there is gone, and in this case, the accumulation of chemicals is probably one of the factors leading to it. So this would be a no.
And the no vegetation.
Yes, along with the lack of vegetation caused by the chemicals, or in part by the chemicals. So saturation of soils, i.e. ponding, flooding, frequency, and duration is sufficient to compose and maintain hydric soils. So we've had some questions kind of related to this already about the surface being inundated relatively frequently, about the vegetation indicating that moisture is being maintained. But here we're saying, is it being shown in the soils as well? So it's just sort of a third round check on have we maintained the soil moisture throughout the site. And again, we're checking this against potential. So digging those soil pits around the outside of where you see vegetation now to see if there historically would have been moisture there is a good thing to check. Number 18, underlying geologic structure, soil material, or permafrost is capable of restricting water percolation. The note here, so wetlands often have an underlying clay or rock material that causes the sites to persist. So that's the idea of sort of a perched aquifer or a locally perched aquifer, where as you receive water sort of from above, whether it's precipitation or snowmelt or floods coming in from uphill, as that water starts to percolate, there's something that keeps it from percolating all the way down. We mentioned earlier that that's called an aquitard or an aquiclude. And the purpose here is to determine whether or not that material is being maintained or has it been altered or damaged by some event or some management action. Because if you do, then you're basically pulling the plug on the bathtub. You lose that water availability. You lose the habitat that was sustained by that water, and you get a transition of plant types and habitat types. We saw this cartoon earlier. Same thing. You dug a little too deep. You pierce that aquitard or aquiclude, and now you've drained the bathtub and you've lost your wetland habitat. Number 19, riparian wetland area is in balance with the water and sediment being supplied by the watershed, i.e. no excessive erosion or deposition. This doesn't mean that you won't have some erosion or you won't have some deposition. The question is, what would the rate of those actions be, or those characteristics be under unaltered circumstances, under pristine conditions? Would your reservoir, so I believe this is the uphill end of Rye Patch Reservoir in Nevada. Oh yes, that's right. So every year there's sediment coming into this reservoir, and without the dam we wouldn't have had the reservoir to start. So that's one thing we need to recognize. But what's the rate of sediment coming into that site, in tons per year or cubic yards per year? Is there something upstream that has caused that to increase or decrease, and then change the rate of change for the sediment input for the site? Again, we're not looking to have zero input of sediment. It's making sure that the rate is what it would be. So if there's no real evidence of excessive deposition, it's not filling in any faster than its normal rate, so you don't see vegetation just completely buried in sediment, there's a good chance that it's a yes. That doesn't mean that you may come across sites where a really high rate of sediment input on an annual basis or every couple of years might be part of the norm and part of the natural disturbance cycle. So that, again, that's knowing regionally the types of habitats you expect to find. Number 20, islands and shoreline characteristics, i.e. rocks, coarse and or large woody material, are adequate to dissipate wind and wave event energies. So we want to determine along the shoreline, so this is very specific to locations with open water, whether or not that shoreline can resist erosion from wave action, basically. So if you're looking at a meadow or a spring that doesn't have open water, this question doesn't apply to it. Thinking about, if you've got particularly sandy shores and you've got a particularly windy area, that wave action, even on small or medium to large sites, you really can start to move a lot of material. And if that material along the shoreline needs to have vegetation on it to stay in place, then if something changes to that, then we want to document that here. Oh, yes, sorry, Sherm just corrected me there. So this one there are shorelines that don't require the vegetation. So this is specific to that coarse or large woody material. So here, this is an example. This is Pyramid Lake here in Nevada, and you can see it's basically got sort of a rocky shoreline there that's helping resist some of that energy rather than dense vegetation. So that's the end of all of the assessment items. Any questions before we go through the idea of making the rating and determination? Okay. So very similar or pretty much the exact same process as the LODIC form. So we start by coming up with a functional rating. Is it properly functioning condition, functional risk, non-functional? Unknown is an option in the older protocol, and because the Lentic protocol has not yet been updated, there's still an unknown in there. And I think that was, correct me if I'm wrong, Sherm, that was more for sites that hadn't yet been assessed than it was for sites that you went out to?
Well, it could be for one that you've assessed, but you just could not make a determination. Okay. You maybe decide that you need to go back and collect some quantitative data in order to make the determination.
Okay, thanks. So then, again, so the trend here, so we've got a parent on there, and Sherm has kind of shoehorned in the monitored version as well. So if we determine that the site is functional at risk, we figure out a trend for it, upward, downward, or not apparent, if we're doing an apparent trend, or if we have some monitoring data to inform us, we do upward, downward, or static. And then there's an additional set of questions that was included in the old format that said, are factors contributing to unacceptable conditions outside of the control of the manager? The idea there being if there was something wrong that was out, if you're on BLM land and the issue is coming from the adjacent private land, it's not something necessarily that the BLM needs to do or can do to help improve the site. So you don't want to sort of knock yourself down for that, but then it may spur you on to look for partnership opportunities to help improve what's going on the other side of the fence. But if there is something that's within the control of the manager, you want to make sure you note those too, so that you and other specialists and the decision makers know what they need to focus on into the future to help improve the site. A lot of that in the new form for the LODIC section, or for the LODIC protocol, is captured in making sure that all of your determinations are really well described. So by describing on the LODIC form the reason that you picked the functional rating, the reason that you picked a trend if appropriate, you're going to include in there some of those risk factors or the things that are less than ideal and based on where those occur, that's going to answer the same sort of question. And then lastly, same thing with the thermometer here. This version isn't split into the thirds within functional at risk and PFC. So putting on that thermometer, you know, whether you think within the functional risk and within the PFC sections, where on that scale do you think you are? You know, are you properly functioning, but you've only just kind of gotten there after improving from functional risk, or do you think there's, you know, you're pretty close to maybe having enough risk to kick yourself down to a functional at risk rating, that sort of a thing. So it's sort of, the whole form is qualitative, but it informs the need potentially for quantitative monitoring. But the thermometer here is sort of the extra qualitative part. This lets you, you know, some people kind of call it kumbaya sort of a thing, feel good, you know, let's all sit by the stream and talk about our feelings. This is where your feelings can really go in, is in this thermometer. But it does help inform people later, give them an idea of where the site was when you saw it. And then before we move on, we'll just read this lentic definition again, just, you know, repetition to make sure that you understand why we're doing this and what we're looking for. Lentic riparian wetland areas are functioning properly when adequate vegetation, landform, or debris is present to dissipate energies associated with wind action, wave action, and overland flow from adjacent sites, thereby reducing erosion and improving water quality, filter sediments and aid floodplain development, improve floodwater retention and groundwater recharge, develop root masses that stabilize islands and shoreline features against cutting action, restrict water percolation, develop diverse ponding characteristics to provide the habitat and water depth, duration, and temperature necessary for fish production, water, bird breeding, and other uses, and support greater biodiversity. It's good when you get in the field to read that for yourselves for two reasons. One is to make sure that you pick out the parts that are applicable to your site based on potential, and two is just to make sure everybody's on the same page in remembering what you're looking for at that site. Because sometimes you can have things that don't look perfect and pristine and pretty, you wouldn't put it on a postcard, but you may still have all of those functions that provide these items that are in this list here. So don't be afraid to call it PFC, especially if you're there immediately after livestock grazing. Sometimes it can look particularly bad, but that sort of ugliness may be in the realm of the resilience of that site, and if you went back 2 or 3 months later, you may not even know that it had occurred. So just keep that in mind. All right, now we're halfway done.
So now it's time to go to the field, which makes the day much more pleasant than the continuation of what you're going to have to suffer through, which is more slides. So usually we talk about what we're going to talk about on the morning of day 2 in a class, and we by that time have been to the field, and by that time you have had a chance to observe some things, sleep on it, and come up with some questions. So it's an excellent time for you to indeed come up with some questions, if you have any, about the assessment. What we've talked about so far is the PFC assessment. What we're going to talk about is how we use that for management, and that's the part that is, for many of us, the most exciting part, but the skill that many of you will be called upon to do is the actual assessment, and then hopefully also the use of it for management. Any questions about the basic assessment?